Hello, this is Elizabeth Chu, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast, created and hosted by my colleague Sydney Derrick, our librarian. This podcast will demystify archives. I am passionate about convincing people that archives are not in any way boring. They are, in fact, incredibly interesting. Who doesn't like to read stories about other people? Imagine spending all day long in a library reading someone else's diary. That is what historians and people who use archives do every day. From the Vault, we'll be telling stories of all South Carolinians from the perspective of the many fascinating items in our large and important archival collections.
Hello there, and I'm Sydney Derrick, librarian here at the South Carolina Historical Society. I'm so excited because we have a bonus episode this month for you because it's Halloween, so we had to do a spooky story. There are so many South Carolina ghost stories that I looked through to try and choose a few to read here, but I ultimately decided to read just one. And that's because I came across a story in our pamphlet collection that was so filled with creepiness, it was reminiscent of Edgar Allan Poe. And the story is actually a mystery in and of itself. It's called Goose Creek Church, a morbid tale. No author is named in the story, and I couldn't find one in my research. It was published in 1901 by a New York company, and only 150 copies were printed. The Historical Society holds copy number 14. Now, it's a short story, only 22 pages, but we did have to shorten it even further a bit for the podcast, just for time's sake. It's based on a legend from the St. James Church in Goose Creek of a woman who was supposedly buried alive and was able to escape her coffin, but ultimately died because she couldn't open the iron door on her tomb. So that gives you some ideas of where this story is going. But before I give away any more spoilers, let's hear Goose Creek Church, a morbid tale. Chapter 1. It was autumn. The dead and dying leaves fell silently, covering the earth like a pall, the forerunner of change and decay. The soft winds moaned through the branches like a sound of many voices. Charles Carrington was weary of the house party with its collection of women and men and small talk and had stolen away for a solitary walk across the hills. With his hands buried in his pocket and an old briarwood pipe between his lips, he strolled along at peace with all the world. He had walked about an hour when he came out on a sandy stretch of road and hesitated, uncertain as to his direction, finally turned to the left and followed its many windings. For some time, heavy laden clouds had been gathering, and now and again the roll of thunder could be distinctly heard. He hastened his steps, being in no wise anxious for a drenching. The road took a sudden turn to the right and terminated abruptly, to his great surprise, in a ruined wall and heavy iron gate. A more vivid flash, followed by a deeper peal, warned him to lose no time, and he broke into a run. Fortunately for him, the gate was unlocked, though it was no easy matter to push it open upon the creaking and rusty hinges. Once inside, he found himself in a small cemetery, the graves and vaults completely surrounding a stone chapel that, like some silent sentinel, stood watch in the middle of the enclosure. The rain was beginning to fall in earnest now, and he hurried on toward the building, regardless of his surroundings. The sighing of the wind through the dripping branches added to the general gloom, while the heavy clouds, blotting out the evening sun, placed a dark and somber hue over the landscape. He was again destined to be surprised, for the chapel door was open, and he entered hurriedly as the rain was now descending in great driving sheets. A wave of damp, cold air seemed to rush forth and envelop him, and for the instant he started back in fear. Then he laughed softly at his childishness and went on. Age and decay was here also. A musty smell of bygone days pervaded the place. The old pews were square and high-backed, and as he sat himself down in one, it creaked and groaned ominously. As his eyes became accustomed to the dim light, he could observe more carefully all the details about him. Above the old altar and carved wooden reredos, he could faintly make out the arms of Great Britain still standing forth in their faded colors. On the walls were stained and broken tablets with their emblazoned crests and coats of arms, placed there, no doubt, for the memory of those long dead and now forgotten. The stained glass windows, weak and broken, failed utterly to keep out the storm, rattling like dead men's bones as the fitful gusts hurled themselves against the walls, while every now and again some bat would dart past, startled from its quiet resting place. Surely, mused Carrington, of all places, this is the most unpleasant. The entire atmosphere is so uncanny that I believe a soaking would have been preferable. A series of vivid lightning flashes lit up the entire building. Carrington sprang from his seat. His limbs were trembling, with great beads of sweat stood out upon his forehead. A frightful fear had taken possession of him. He tried to cry aloud, but from his parched throat there came no sound. What was it, an idea? He did not know, he could not tell, merely that awful certainty that he was not alone. In vain he tried to overcome the fear, to steady his unstrung nerves. He stood there swaying like a reed. Step after step fell upon the flagging stones and faintly echoed along the aisle as this thing slowly approached. Never before had such an all-pervading fear possessed him. With trembling hands he grasped the pew. The very beating of his heart had ceased. Nearer and nearer came the steps. Now it was beside him, yet he could not, dared not look. And then it passed. A long-drawn sigh of relief escaped him. Intense agony was lifted from his soul. Before him he saw the slight, graceful figure of a girl as she slowly passed along the aisle. She spoke no word, but turned and glanced inquiringly at him, and when she reached the foremost pew, entered and sank down upon her knees, burying her face between her hands. Carrington watched as she knelt in silent prayer. Who could she be? What could she want in such a dreary place? At last her meditations came to an end. Wearily, she rose and looked toward him. He left his place, coming to her. What are you doing here? Her voice was low and sweet. Might I not ask you the same question? Surely it is a dreary place for either of us. As for myself, I came to escape the storm, and I, as no doubt you saw, to pray. You could hardly have chosen a worse time or more desolate surroundings. I cannot quite agree with you. I am very fond of this old church. Are you never afraid? She laughed softly. What foolish questions you ask. Why should I be? She sat down, making room for Carrington beside her. To tell the truth, Miss... He hesitated. Coleman, she prompted, smiling. Miss Coleman, he continued. I never in all my life have been so frightened. I presume the dreariness of the place had something to do with it. But when I heard your footsteps and realized that someone besides myself was here, I confessed to being possessed by such unreasoning fear that I was actually afraid to look round. Had I only done so, I should have been saved a very disagreeable 5 minutes. She looked at him quizzically. And yet, you do not appear to be a man easily alarmed. After all, what were you fearful of? Surely not of the dead. They can do no harm. Yes and no. Oh, I quite agree with you that it is all very foolish, but you cannot always control your feelings, I suppose. He continued after a pause, as if following some train of thought. These graves and vaults have been unused for centuries, all except our own. The Coleman family is a very old one, and my father is somewhat tenacious of ancient customs. Every member, sooner or later, will have the privilege of occupying the family vault. Not the most agreeable of outlooks, I should imagine. Oh, I don't know. It depends upon one's point of view. Death is no worse than life. One happens to be as great a mystery as the other. That may be perfectly true, Miss Coleman. After all is said, we come back to the same old argument. We know what we are to expect of life. We are somewhat uncertain of death. It appears to me that one is quite uncertain of life. From day to day, one can foretell what will happen? I doubt it. True. Then why fear one more than the other? I fancy you have the best of the argument. Doubtless, however, it is owing to the way we are brought up. You know, death is always painted in rather gruesome colors. Yes, but it is utterly foolish. Death is but a long sleep where the cares and troubles and trials of life are forever blotted out. So you do not believe in a hereafter? No. What, may I ask, is the possible use of life if it is only to end in a deep sleep? Is everything that man has accomplished to go for nothing? Of course not. What he succeeds in doing helps his fellow man. But I see you are not convinced. Do not think me sacrilegious when I say that God alone knows and he is content to keep silent. Well, so far no one has come back from the grave to tell us aught. Please forgive me. It is getting late and I must be going. I believe I told you that my name is Edith Coleman, but I do not think you mentioned yours. Charles Carrington. I would ask you to see me home did I not live so near and were there not good reasons. And may I see you again? If you care to. I'm sorry, however, that I could not ask you to my father's house, but it is impossible. And where, then, am I likely to find you? I come here every day at about this time. Again, goodbye. At dinner that same evening, several of the guests twitted Carrington upon his solitary walk. He only laughed good-naturedly, remarking that his adventures consisted principally in a thunderstorm and an old church in which he had taken refuge. Why, surely that must have been the Goose Creek Church, broke in his hostess. It is quite a historical bit, dating back somewhere about 1670. Did you notice the arms of England over the altar? That is something hard to find in America today. Carrington remained silent. He was weighing in his mind whether or not to speak of Miss Coleman. At last he hazarded this question. Is your plantation, Mrs. Wheeler, the nearest one to this church? Oh, no. The Coleman homestead adjoins it. I believe Mr. Coleman still keeps up a certain interest, although the chapel is falling into utter decay. It really is a shame that all of us do not club together and put it into some sort of repair, though, to my mind, it is one of the dreariest spots around here, and for that reason I keep away. Carrington was not quite sure whether he agreed with her or not, but he kept silent all the same. Chapter 2. Each following day, at about the same time in the afternoon, Carrington managed on one pretext or another to absent himself. Had anyone taken the trouble to watch our young friend, which in all probability no one did, they would have seen that his steps turned always in the direction of the Goose Creek Church. What had occurred at the first meeting was repeated at all subsequent ones, and although the strange fear of the place slightly diminished, he never felt quite at ease while waiting for Miss Coleman's coming. During these few days, he had come to know her extremely well. There was a certain freedom and unconventionality about it all. The more he saw of her, the more fascinating she seemed, and these long talks in the old church made the hours pass with amazing swiftness. There was one peculiarity about the girl, at least so he thought. She would never allow their conversation to become in any way personal. She did not seem to care to talk of him. She would not talk about herself. Charles Carrington would hardly be termed particularly susceptible. Still, he was like any other man, and a woman with so much charm as Miss Coleman could not fail by exercise over him a certain influence. There was scarcely a doubt that he imagined himself somewhat in love. Every attempt, however, of his to bring the conversation to a sentimental basis had proved a dismal failure, and after 5 days he found himself just where he had been in the beginning. He was becoming desperate. The fact that his wishes were always thwarted only added to their intensity, and he was working himself into a state of mind, or perhaps heart, that really had no reason for existing. On this particular afternoon, he had quite decided to bring matters to a head, whether or not she gave him the chance. Not that he wished exactly to ask her to be his wife, that might be considered a trifle sudden, and was, after all, not what he wanted. He really was not altogether certain that he was in love. It might turn out to be a pleasant summer's dream. The entire situation amused him. For some time, at least, he knew this would be their last meeting. The party at the Pines broke up the following day, and he had no possible excuse for remaining longer. He looked at his watch. He was already late, and when at last he reached the church, he found her waiting. She smiled at him sweetly, perhaps more sweetly than was absolutely necessary, so he thought, as he sat down beside her in the high-backed pew. "You are late." "Ah, I see already," she said. "You are tiring of my society. Strange the world has not changed, and men are as they always have been." Carrington protested. "I was only joking," she went on. "Of course, I know you must have many engagements and other interests. Indeed, it is very good of you to waste the time you do and come to this dreary spot merely to amuse me. I was in hopes it might be more than just amuse." She put up her finger warningly. "We are getting on dangerous ground. I absolutely forbid any insinuations of that kind." Her voice sounded half grave and half mocking. "Then I will not insinuate, but speak plainly. No, you must do as I request. We are very good friends, and that is quite sufficient. Why spoil a pleasant situation? Besides, you may regret it. But sometimes one is forced to speak." She became grave at once. "Mr. Carrington, you will not be offended if I put things plainly to you?" "Certainly not." "Then let me tell you the truth, and if I am wrong, correct me. We met by the merest of chances. It was through no fault of mine, and frankly, I am more than sorry that we did." Carrington winced. "In saying this, I do not intend to be rude. It was certainly very pleasant to see you, for mine is a rather dreary life. We became friends and continued so until you discovered that I had every intention of remaining merely on that footing. A little sentiment between a man and a woman can hardly be termed a grievous sin. Still, as far as we were concerned, I did not wish it, and I had my reasons. Manlike, you desired that most which you could not obtain. Remember, it is hardly a week since we have known each other, and no doubt you have argued yourself into a belief that for me you have a genuine affection. Now do not protest, but listen. In your heart of hearts, you know you care nothing." Whatever he may have thought or believed, he refused to allow such thoughts and beliefs to govern him now. He might not exactly be in love, but for the moment at least, he considered himself perilously near it. "No, I swear to you, you are wrong." "I cannot tell you, Mr. Carrington, how you disappoint me. Professions of love are so cheap. Friendship is so rare. I was in hopes we might remain friends, for if not that, then we can be nothing." The man seemed as one possessed. Perhaps it was her beauty and charm, perhaps merely the workings of his own imagination that had bewitched him. "Edith, can you not see? Can you not understand? I love you." He knew when he uttered the words that he lied. She seemed to read his innermost thoughts, and as she watched him, he could not prevent the telltale blood from mounting to his face. "It seems a pity you could not leave well enough alone." She spoke in a low voice, but it seemed to add force to her words. "But all men are alike. They protest, and there is the end to it. Do you care to know what true love is? Then listen. You say that you love me. We will grant that it is so. What is that, me? My soul, my mind, my very self? No. That me to you is the form of a woman. Her face is fair and round, her skin is white and smooth, her hair is soft, her lips are red, her teeth are white. The curves of her figure show in graceful lines. That, my friend, is a description of what you love. There is no need to heart or soul, no need for that head, if only pretty, to contain one atom of brain, and you call that love. Would your love outlive the fires of youth when the finger of time had placed its seal of age and decay? Would it endure when health and strength and beauty had gone? Is it strong enough for that? No. Man's love is like a fragile flower. At the first cold blast it droops, then fades and dies. The intensity of her words startled him, but he could not draw back now. "Put me to any test, Edith," he cried, taking her unresisting hand and looking longingly into her face. "I will love you in spite of everything." She laughed her low, sweet laugh. "You swear it?" "I swear it." "Then follow me." A nervous chill passed over him, and again that fearful dread began to creep upon his soul. Surely she was the strangest being he had ever met. He followed her along the aisle, and together they passed out into the chill air. The autumn afternoon was nearly spent. The wind blew the fallen leaves in little eddies. The ground was damp and sodden. In silence they walked, threading their way between dilapidated graves. About them was the silence of the dead. "Where are you going?" he queried irritably. "Wait, and you will soon see, and remember your promise." "Oh, never fear, I will remember it." And he laughed, but it sounded hollow and unreal. At length they stopped before a vault. It was in better repair than the others, being built of heavy blocks of granite, now almost covered with lichen and mold. The nail-studded door looked rickety and insecure. Carved deep in the stone above the entrance was the name Coleman. And who... But Carrington never finished that sentence. He looked round to address his companion, but she was gone. Again, that fearful fear possessed him. Again, he would have cried aloud, but the sounds died in his throat. Hopelessly, he gazed about him as one in a trance. All around was deathlike and still. He called her name. A faint, distant echo was the only answer. Again and again he called. My God, what had become of her? What can it mean? Is it a trick? Yes, of course it is a trick. Why did I not think of that before? And he laughed hysterically. There is some other entrance to this place, and she knew of it. What a perfect ass I have been, but by heaven, she has given me a fright. I will find her, though, even if I have to break it open. Then it will be my turn to laugh. With nervous energy suiting his actions to his words, he grasped the iron handle. Pressing his knee against the wall with all his strength, he forced the door outward, and with a crashing sound, the lock gave way and it flew open. Something that had evidently been propped against it fell in a confused mass at his feet. Standing there, breathless from his own exertions, at first he seemed to realize nothing, then the horror of it flashed across his mind. It was a human body. He put his hands before his eyes and for an instant stood there swaying, then with a moan fell forward upon his face beside that awful thing. Chapter 3. For months, Charles Carrington in his New York home lay hovering between life and death. The fever of his brain had well nigh killed him. At first he remembered nothing, but by slow degrees the horror with its ghastly details returned to his mind. His frequent visits to the church, the meetings with Miss Coleman, and then the fearful end. How did it all happen? He thought he must be mad. A morbid curiosity took possession of him until he could no longer bear the uncertainty. He would see Mrs. Wheeler and, if possible, get some solution to the mystery. You wish me to tell you all I know. I warn you, it is enough to make you ill again. For months I have been unable to get it out of my mind. On the last day of your visit, perhaps you may remember, you went out in the afternoon for a solitary walk. Dinner time came and you did not return. Towards 9, we all became very anxious, and some of the men went out to search for you, but met with no success. None of us slept that night, and it was thanks to Miss Warrenton that you were found. She recalled the fact that you had once mentioned the Goose Creek Church. The rest of us had never even dreamed of the place. Well, there we found you, lying on your face in front of the Coleman vault, but that was not the terrible part. The door had been forced open, and alongside you lay the body of Edith Coleman. Carrington gave a start. The body was in a horrible state of decomposition, so the men said. Of course, after bringing you home, they went back at once to carefully investigate the matter, and this is what they found. The rest can only be conjecture. The lid of her coffin, for some unaccountable reason, had not been securely fastened and was forced off. The lining was frightfully torn, as if there had been a terrific struggle. Her body must have been leaning up against the vault door, otherwise when it was broken open, it would not have fallen out. And who was Edith Coleman? She was the eldest daughter of Mr. James Coleman, who was our nearest neighbor. Some months ago she died and was buried in the family vault. Her father was deeply grieved over her death, as she was his favorite child, and right after the funeral, he closed his house and went to Europe. Now, here is the frightful part, and it makes me shudder even to think about it. Though it is only a theory, the facts seem to bear it out beyond a doubt. I was at the funeral, and the lifelike look of Edith even then was commented upon. The upper part of the coffin lid was off so that those present might have a last look at the girl. I remember now wondering at the time if she were really dead, and how awful being buried alive would be. Of course, not for one instant did I imagine that such a thing could happen, but you know how queer thoughts will sometimes intrude themselves. Now, bearing this in mind, and in light of the subsequent events, it seems as if there could be no other explanation than that she was still alive when the coffin was placed in the vault. By some oversight, the lid could not have been securely put on, for this was found off. The torn lining and the plain marks of fingernails showed conclusively that there had been an awful struggle for breath and life. It would appear that the girl had strength to force the lid, to drag herself as far as the door of the vault, and there on her knees before it her strength had given out, and she had died. It is almost too horrible for words. To think of the agony that poor creature must have suffered when she found that her almost superhuman efforts were in vain, that she was barred in and she had to die. But what is the matter? You look ill. Oh, nothing. Might I trouble you for some brandy? I am still weak from my illness, and your story is ghastly indeed. May I ask you one more question? What sort of looking girl was Edith Coleman? Tall and slight, with a most graceful figure, blue eyes and golden hair, and was considered very beautiful. She was also one of the most charming girls I ever met. Carrington rose. I must be going, he said, for I am still feeling far from strong. Yes, if your man will call me a handsome, I shall be much obliged. And that is the end of Goose Creek Church, a morbid tale. So hopefully that satisfies the need for any spookiness during this Halloween season. We'll be back in November with our next regularly scheduled episode of the podcast, so we'll see you then.